The Galactic Council had existed for over 9,000 years. It was made up of 47 civilizations, each one older, stronger, and more advanced than anything humans had ever built. They had mapped every corner of the known universe. They had watched stars die and new ones burn to life. They had seen entire species rise from the mud and then fall back into it. So when their long-range sensors picked up a small, noisy blue planet in the outer rim of an unremarkable solar system, they were not impressed. They were barely curious. Earth had been placed under observation about 300 years ago, when humanity had first managed to split the atom. That was the moment most species caught the Council's attention, not because splitting atoms was impressive, but because it usually meant a civilization was about to destroy itself. The Council had a term for it. They called it the fire stage. Most species never survived it. They either burned their own world to cinders, or they poisoned their air and oceans slowly, quietly, until nothing was left. The Council had seen it happen so many times that they had stopped counting. But Earth did not burn. It came close several times. There were wars, plagues, climate disasters, and moments where the whole species seemed to be standing on the edge of a cliff. And yet somehow, every single time, humanity pulled itself back. Not cleanly, not without pain, but it pulled back. The Council observers found this mildly interesting, the way you might find a stubborn weed growing through concrete mildly interesting. It did not change their overall assessment. Humans were still a low-level species with no faster-than-light travel, no energy shields, no colony worlds, and no seat at any galactic table. The formal contact was made on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. 3 enormous ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond the moon. They were not hiding. They sent a signal in every human language simultaneously. A signal so perfectly translated that linguists on Earth could not explain how it was possible. The message was calm and polite and left no room for argument. Earth was being formally annexed into the Galactic Council's sphere of influence. Humans would be recognized as a protected species. They would be given basic medical technology in exchange for resource access rights on their moon, their asteroid belt, and 3 of their outer planets. There would be no negotiation. This was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. The human governments took 4 days to respond. The Council found this slightly irritating. Most species responded within hours, usually with some version of complete agreement. When Earth's unified response finally came through, it was not what the Council had been expecting. The humans said they appreciated the offer. They said they understood the power difference. And then they said no. Not a conditional no. Not a please give us time to think no. A flat, clear, simple no, followed by a legal counterproposal so detailed and aggressive that the Council's translation AI took almost an hour to process it. High Counselor Vareth, a being who had been governing galactic affairs for longer than most human civilizations had existed, read the response 3 times. Then he read it again. He had never, in 9,000 years of Council history, seen a newly contacted species respond this way. Every clause in the human counterproposal was technically valid under galactic law. Every argument was logically sound. The humans had clearly studied the Council's own legal framework and had used it as a weapon against the very terms being offered. Vareth found himself sitting quietly for a long moment, staring at the document on his screen. He pulled up the observer reports on humanity going back 3 centuries. He read about the wars they had fought against each other. He read about the diseases they had survived, the famines, the floods, the collapses of civilizations that had somehow always led to new ones rising from the rubble. He read about their weapons programs, which were still primitive by Council standards, but had been developing at a rate that was, if he was honest with himself, somewhat remarkable for a species that had only had electricity for 150 years. He read about their space programs, which had accelerated dramatically in the last 50 years, the last 20 especially. And then he read something in the observer notes that made him pause. A small line, almost thrown away in a report from 70 years ago. One of the observer drones had picked up a human radio broadcast. A speech, given by a man who was about to send other men to the moon using technology that should not have worked as well as it did. The man had said something about choosing to do hard things not because they were easy, but because they were hard. Vareth sat with that line for a while. It was not the kind of thing any other species had ever said out loud, let alone made into a guiding principle of action. He called an emergency session of the full council. He told them the annexation proposal had been rejected. The room went completely silent. Then came the outrage. Then came the voices calling for the standard enforcement response. A show of force, a demonstration of what the council's military was capable of, the kind of thing that had always worked before. Vareth listened to all of it. Then he raised one hand, and the room went quiet again. He told them he wanted to give the humans 60 more days. Not because he thought they would change their minds, but because something in those old observer reports was telling him that they needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with before they made any moves. The room argued, but in the end, they gave him his 60 days. Down on Earth, in a secure bunker deep under Geneva, a room full of the planet's best scientists, military strategists, diplomats, and engineers were not celebrating their rejection of the Council's terms. They were working. They had known this moment was coming for years, not because of any advanced warning, but because several of their own scientists had independently predicted contact within a decade based on patterns in deep space signals they had been quietly tracking. They had prepared. Not enough, not nearly enough, but more than anyone watching from above would have guessed. They had plans inside plans, contingencies inside contingencies, and a particular kind of stubborn, calculated, slightly reckless determination that was, if you were being honest, one of the most human things that had ever existed. The 60 days passed faster than anyone expected. On Earth, they were 60 days of almost no sleep. The Geneva bunker never went dark. People worked in shifts, but the shifts blurred into each other. Food was brought in trays and eaten cold. Arguments broke out at 3 in the morning and were somehow resolved by sunrise. Engineers who had spent their careers working on theoretical propulsion systems were now being asked to make those theories real in weeks. Physicists who had only ever published papers were being handed funding numbers that made them go pale and then immediately get back to their whiteboards. The most important breakthrough came on day 31. A team from 4 different countries, working on a problem they had been stuck on for almost a decade, solved it in a single night. It was not elegant. It was not clean. It was the kind of solution that made other scientists wince when they saw it, because it was built entirely from workarounds and clever hacks and sheer refusal to accept that something could not be done. But it worked. They had found a way to generate a localized gravity field using technology that was, at its core, built from components already in mass production on Earth. It was inefficient by any galactic standard. It used enormous amounts of power, but it could be scaled. And scaling things was something humans had always been surprisingly good at. Meanwhile, the diplomats were doing their own kind of work. They had obtained full access to the Council's public legal archives, a database that the Council had made freely available to all recognized species as a show of openness. The humans had torn through it. Every treaty ever signed, every enforcement action ever taken, every case where a species had resisted, and every case where resistance had worked, even partially. They found patterns the Council had probably never expected anyone to look for, because no one had ever needed to look. They found 3 separate historical precedents where a species had successfully delayed annexation using procedural challenges under galactic law. In 2 of those cases, the delay had lasted long enough for the species in question to negotiate actual terms rather than simply accept what was offered. The humans filed 47 procedural challenges on day 38. 1 for each member civilization of the Council. Each challenge was individually prepared, individually documented, and individually valid under the Council's own legal code. The Council's legal office, which had not had a genuinely complicated case in over 600 years, suddenly found itself with more work than it could process. The head of the office, a being named Soreth who had held the position for 2 centuries and had always considered the job largely ceremonial, looked at the mountain of filings and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt challenged. Up on the 3 Council ships still parked beyond Earth's moon, the commanding officer, Admiral Keth, received a report from his intelligence team that made him set down his morning briefing and stare at the wall. According to the report, human military production had increased by over 300% in the last 30 days. Not weapons production specifically, but industrial output broadly, the kind of scaling up of manufacturing that typically preceded a major military buildup. Satellite launches had doubled. There were unusual energy readings coming from 17 different locations on the planet's surface, readings that did not match any known human technology, but also did not quite match any council technology either. Something new was being built, something that had not existed a month ago. Keth requested a closer observation sweep. His request came back denied, not by the council, but by his own navigation team. 2 of the new human satellites had been placed in orbits that were, technically, within the approach corridors used by council observation drones. The satellites were not weapons. They were not sending threatening signals. They were simply there, in exactly the right positions, doing exactly enough to make close observation legally complicated under the council's own rules of engagement with unconfirmed non-hostile species. Keth stared at the navigation report for a long time. Then he requested a direct communication channel to the human command bunker. The channel opened, and a woman appeared on his screen. She was middle-aged, had the look of someone who had not slept well in a month, and was eating something directly from a container with one hand while reviewing a document with the other. She looked up at the screen, put the container down, and said hello in a tone that suggested she had been expecting this call and had more important things to get back to afterward. Her name was Director Yael Moran. She had spent her entire career in aerospace engineering before being pulled into the Geneva project. She had been chosen not because she was a politician or a general, but because she understood systems, and the situation they were in was, at its core, a systems problem. Keth told her that the council was aware of the industrial buildup. He told her that continued resistance was not in humanity's interest. He told her, carefully and without explicit threat, that the council had options it had not yet chosen to use. Moran listened to all of this. Then she asked him one question. She asked him how long it had been since the council had actually fought a war. Not a suppression action, not an enforcement operation. An actual war, against an opponent that had chosen to fight back and meant it. Keth did not answer immediately. The honest answer was that it had been over 4,000 years, and even then it had been a fairly brief conflict against a species that had surrendered after the first exchange. Moran did not press him for an answer. She simply thanked him for the call, told him the human legal team would be filing an additional 9 procedural challenges in the morning, and signed off. Keth sat in his command chair for a long time after the screen went dark. He sent a new report to the council. It was longer and more detailed than any report he had sent before. In it, for the first time, he used a word that had not appeared in any council document regarding Earth in 300 years of observation. The word was threat. Not a significant one, he was careful to say. Not something the council could not handle, but something that deserved to be taken seriously, because the thing about humanity, the thing that all 300 years of observation reports had recorded without quite understanding, was that they did not fight the way other species fought. They did not fight to win what was possible. They fought to make possible what should not have been. The council received his report on day 59. They scheduled an emergency session for the following morning. That night, with 1 day left in Veritha's 60-day window, something launched from 17 different locations on Earth simultaneously. Not weapons. 17 ships, small by any galactic standard, built from a combination of existing human aerospace technology and the new gravity drive that had been developed in 31 days from a decade of theoretical work. They were not fast. They were not armed, not exactly. But they rose out of the atmosphere together, in a coordinated burn that was, by any measure, the single most impressive thing humanity had ever managed to put into space. And they held formation. Steady, deliberate, and pointed directly at the 3 council ships beyond the moon. 17 ships in formation was not, by itself, a military threat. The council's 3 vessels each outmassed the entire human fleet by a factor of several thousand. A single broadside from the smallest council ship could have turned every one of those 17 vessels into vapor without the weapons systems even warming up properly. Admiral Keth knew this. His crew knew this. Every member of the council emergency session, which had been pulled forward and was now convening in real time as the human ships climbed out of Earth's atmosphere, knew this. And yet the room was not calm. It was not calm because of the readings. As the 17 ships rose, the sensor arrays on all 3 council vessels began picking up something that none of the analysts could immediately explain. The gravity signature coming off the human ships was wrong. Not in a way that suggested malfunction. in a way that suggested the humans had done something with a gravity drive that the Council's own engineers had considered theoretically possible, but practically useless at this scale. They had linked them. 17 individual gravity drives, all running at maximum inefficiency by any standard measure, but networked together in a configuration that produced a combined gravitational output far larger than the sum of its parts. It was the engineering equivalent of 17 people who each had one candle deciding to stand in a tight circle and use the combined heat to melt something none of them could melt alone. The lead analyst on Keth's ship, a being named Preth who had been scanning alien technology for 60 years and had never been surprised by anything, looked at the readings for a long time, and then said quietly that he was not sure the Council had a weapon system that could reliably target all 17 simultaneously if they were maintaining that kind of field coherence. Keth told him to run the numbers again. Preth ran them again. The answer did not change. Keth told him to run them a third time. Preth looked at his admiral with the patient expression of someone who already knew what the third answer was going to be and ran them again anyway. On day 60, Director Moran opened a communication channel to the Council ships. She was in the same bunker, at the same workstation, but this time she was not eating from a container. She was sitting straight, in a clean jacket, with the quiet confidence of someone who had just watched the last piece of a very complicated plan fall into place. She told Admiral Keth that humanity was formally requesting a new round of negotiations, not under the original annexation framework, under a completely different section of galactic law, one that applied to species that had demonstrated independent FTL-capable flight, which the 17 ships, using their linked gravity drive, technically qualified as under the most generous reading of the relevant statute. It was not a clean argument, but it was a legally defensible one, and the humans had 47 procedural challenges already in the pipeline to make sure any counter-argument took a very long time to resolve. Keth forwarded everything to the Council. Then he did something he had never done in his career. He sent a private message directly to High Counselor Vareth, bypassing official channels entirely. The message was 4 sentences long. It said that in his professional assessment, the humans were not bluffing. It said that engaging them militarily would work, but would cost more than the Council had paid for anything in 4,000 years. It said that Earth's resources, while valuable, were not so uniquely valuable that the cost was obviously worth it. And it said that he thought Vareth's instinct to wait had been right, and that the 60 days had revealed something the observation reports had never quite captured, which was that humanity did not get more frightened when the pressure increased. They got more focused. Vareth read the message during the emergency session. He did not share it with the room. He let the session run. He listened to all the arguments about precedent and authority and what it would mean for the Council's standing if a species this young and this primitive was seen to successfully resist integration. He listened to the hardliners who wanted an immediate enforcement response. He listened to the moderates who wanted more time. And then, when everyone had spoken, he stood up and said something that silenced the room more completely than anything else could have. He said he had been watching humanity for 300 years, and in all that time, across all the reports and all the data, one pattern had appeared so consistently that he now believed it was not a pattern, but a fundamental characteristic of the species. He said that humans seemed to be physically incapable of accepting a ceiling. Every time a limit was placed on them, whether by nature, by circumstance, or by another species, they treated it not as a boundary, but as a starting point. He said that the Council had spent 9,000 years accumulating power and influence by being the largest thing in the room, and that this had worked, always, because every other species they had encountered had looked at the size of the Council and made a rational decision to accommodate it. Humans, he said, looked at the size of the Council and immediately started trying to figure out how to be bigger. He proposed a genuine negotiation, not a softened version of the original annexation terms. An actual negotiation, starting from the human counterproposal, treating Earth as a sovereign entity seeking a relationship with the Council rather than a resource to be managed by it. The room exploded. It took almost 2 hours to bring it back to order. But in the end, because Vareth had been right about everything for 9,000 years and the Council knew it, they voted to open the channel. 41-6. The 6 dissenters were loud, and they were angry, and 3 of them filed formal objections that would be entered into the historical record. But the vote was the vote, Down in the Geneva bunker, Moran received the message that the Council was agreeing to new negotiations under the framework her team had proposed. She read it twice. Then she stood up and walked to the window of the bunker, which did not actually have a view of anything because they were underground, but which she stood at anyway out of habit. Behind her, the room erupted. People were crying. People were hugging. Someone had apparently kept a bottle of something in their desk for exactly this moment and was now opening it with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Moran stood at the windowless wall for about 30 seconds. Then she turned around and told everyone to please sit back down, because the negotiation itself was going to be the hardest part, and they had maybe 12 hours before the Council's team was ready to begin. The celebration stopped. People sat down. Screens came back on. Documents were pulled up. Someone took the bottle and put it back in the desk for later. Because that was the other thing about humanity. The thing that Keth had tried to explain and Vareth had somehow understood from an old radio broadcast about choosing hard things. They could feel the moment. They could recognize when something important had happened. And then they could set it aside and get back to work because the work was never finished, and they had always known it, and somehow that had never once been enough to stop them. The negotiations lasted 11 months. They were conducted partly in orbit, aboard a neutral station that the Council had constructed specifically for the occasion, and partly through encrypted channels between Geneva and the Council's administrative capital on a world 40 light-years away. The human team was 17 people. The Council's team was over 200. The humans brought fewer people because they had found, early on, that larger groups moved slower, and speed was something they had decided to treat as a strategic asset. They also brought a rotating schedule, so that fresh people were always at the table, while the Council's team, which had not anticipated negotiations lasting this long with this much back and forth, began to show signs of exhaustion that the humans carefully noted and filed away. The Council's chief negotiator was a being named Arev, who had negotiated 43 planetary integrations over the course of a very long career and had never once failed to reach an agreement on the Council's preferred terms. He found the human team to be simultaneously the most frustrating and the most interesting opponents he had encountered in his entire professional life. They were not predictable. Most species, when pushed, retreated to their core position and held it. The humans, when pushed, did something different. They pivoted. They introduced new angles. They filed new documents. They found third-party galactic precedents that technically applied in ways nobody had anticipated. And just when Arev thought he understood the shape of what they wanted, they would offer a concession so unexpected that his entire team would need to regroup and reassess. What they wanted, it turned out, was not simply to avoid annexation. That had been the defensive layer, the thing they had fought for in order to buy time. What they actually wanted was a seat. Not a small one. Not a junior observer seat, which was what the Council offered young species as a way of making them feel included without giving them any actual influence. They wanted a full voting seat in the Council chamber, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. They argued, using a legal framework so carefully constructed that it had clearly been in development for years before first contact, that their demonstrated capacity for independent FTL flight, their technological innovation rate, and their successful procedural resistance to annexation collectively met every criterion for full membership under the Council's own foundational charter, a document so old that most Council members had never actually read it. Arev read it. Then he called in 3 of the Council's top constitutional scholars and had them read it. The scholars came back 4 days later looking uncomfortable. One of them said that the humans were not wrong. The other 2 agreed. The foundational charter had been written 9,000 years ago, at a time when nobody had imagined a species would ever use it this aggressively, and it had a number of provisions that, taken together, did in fact support the human argument. Arev sent a report to Vareth that was, for the first time in his career, genuinely uncertain in its conclusions. He said that the humans could potentially win this legally. He said that even if the Council overruled the charter argument on technical grounds, the process would take decades, and the humans would use every one of those decades to grow stronger, more capable, and more deeply integrated into the galactic community in ways that would make their eventual admission effectively inevitable anyway. He recommended settling. Vareth did not immediately respond. He spent 3 days reviewing everything. The 300 years of observer reports. Ket's private message. the legal analysis, the negotiation transcripts, all 11 months of them. And one more thing, something he had requested from the archives on a quiet personal interest. He had asked for the full recording of that radio broadcast from 70 years ago, the speech about choosing hard things. He listened to it in his private office, alone, the way you might do with something you wanted to think about without interruption. The man in the recording had a voice that carried a particular quality, a quality that Vareth had heard in maybe a dozen other species over 9,000 years, the quality of someone who genuinely believed what they were saying and was saying it because they needed other people to believe it too. Not performance. Conviction. On the 342nd day of negotiations, Vareth himself took the chair at the council table. This was unprecedented. The High Counselor did not attend negotiations. That was what envoys were for. His presence sent an immediate signal through both teams that something had changed. He looked at Director Moran across the table, who had been present for every single session, who looked like she had aged 3 years in the past 11 months and did not seem to mind at all, and he told her that the council was prepared to offer full membership. Not junior membership, not observer status. Full membership, with a single condition. The condition was time. Earth would hold full voting rights immediately, but would operate under a mentorship arrangement for 50 years, during which the Council would provide unrestricted access to its full technological archive in exchange for human participation in a knowledge-sharing program that ran in the other direction as well. Vareth told her, and he was speaking carefully because he wanted to be precise, that in 9,000 years of governing the galaxy, the Council had never encountered a species that innovated the way humans did, that the gravity drive configuration those 17 ships had used was something his own engineers were still trying to fully understand, and that the arrangement he was proposing was not charity. It was an investment. The Council wanted to learn from humanity as much as it wanted humanity to learn from it. Moran was quiet for a moment. Then she asked for a recess. She stepped out of the chamber with her team, and they were gone for 40 minutes. When they came back, she sat down, folded her hands on the table, and said yes. Not a conditional yes. Not a we need to review the details yes. A clear, direct yes, followed by a handshake that was physically awkward because Vareth had 4 hands and she had 2, and neither of them had quite figured out the protocol, which made both of them laugh, which nobody in the room had been expecting, and which somehow made the whole thing feel real in a way that all the documents and votes and legal arguments had not. Earth's formal induction into the Galactic Council took place 6 weeks later, aboard the same neutral station where the negotiations had been held. Every member civilization sent representatives. 41 of them were there because they had voted for it. 6 were there because refusing to attend would have looked worse than attending. Keth was there because Vareth had specifically requested his presence, and because he had written in his final report on the Earth situation that he hoped, in whatever small way, that he had contributed to the outcome by raising an honest flag when it mattered. Soreth, the head of the legal office who had not felt challenged in 2 centuries, was there because she had personally sent Director Moran a message saying she intended to come, not as a representative of the Council, but because she wanted to see for herself what species looked like when it fought for its own future and won. Moran stood in the chamber and listened to the formal words being read, words that had been read 47 times before for 47 other species, and she thought about the Geneva bunker, and the people who had eaten cold food from trays and argued at 3 in the morning and cried when the first real breakthrough came. She thought about the 17 ships that had risen out of the atmosphere together, not because it was safe or smart, but because the alternative was accepting a ceiling. And she thought about something one of her engineers had said during the worst week of the 60 days, when nothing was working and the gravity drive team was 12 hours away from declaring the whole concept impossible. He had said that the thing about impossible was that it kept turning out not to be. And she had put that up on the wall of the bunker, and it had stayed there for the rest of the 11 months, and people had walked past it every day without saying anything about it, because they did not need to. They already knew. The vote was read into the official record. Earth was a member of the Galactic Council. The room was quiet for a moment in the way that large rooms sometimes are when something genuinely significant has happened and everyone in them knows it. Then it was not quiet anymore. And somewhere 40 light-years away, in a bunker under Geneva that now had a real window because someone had finally gotten around to renovating it, a bottle that had spent 11 months in a desk drawer was finally, properly opened.